Okay, please read with me John 15, if you have your Bibles. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, and you are the branches. Those who abide in me, and I in them, bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments, and I abide in his love. I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, because the servant does not know what the master is doing. But I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. You did not choose me, but I chose you, and I appointed you to go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another. So as I'm sitting in my chair with this scripture, trying to figure out how am I gonna pursue this in a new way, in an engaging way. I'm watching the Dark Knight trilogy, and I'm watching Batman Begins, and it just kind of all of a sudden kind of welled up that this really applies to Batman. At the beginning of Batman Begins, Bruce Wayne, it's not Batman yet, Bruce Wayne is in prison in Korea or China, somewhere in Asia, and he uses it as a chance to fight criminals. But then Bruce Wayne is found by the League of Shadows, and he's trained up, and he becomes Batman, and then he returns to Gotham City to once again fight criminals, but on a whole new level, behind the mask of Batman, so that he can be a symbol and not just one guy fighting one criminal at a time. And as I'm watching it, I'm thinking, Batman is by himself, he's not doing much, he gets connected to some people with a like mind, and he starts to follow what his heart says justice is, until he comes to his true vine, that is Commissioner Gordon, who's not yet Commissioner Gordon, Sergeant Gordon, but soon to be Commissioner Gordon and the District Attorney's Office. And with this connection to the true vine, he can really focus his efforts, and he has a whole new system of gathering information on criminals to better take Gotham back from criminals. And I don't want to say that the disciples are necessarily in a similar situation, but I think Jesus he's talking about the same thing in this passage. It's part of Jesus' farewell discourse that involves the Last Supper and this passage, and then his priestly prayer in John 17. And he kind of breaks up the prophetic speeches and his long priestly prayer with something a little closer to what the disciples are used to, and that's a return to parable teaching. Verses 1 through 6 are they're basically a type of parable about vines, branches, and fruitfulness. And I think that the key verse here, the key phrase is right at the beginning. Jesus says, "I am the real vine," or the true vine. I get this idea that by that qualification as being the true vine or the real vine, that there's power in it. There's power of the love of the Father and Son that allows us to bear fruit and, as he says, be pruned by the Father to be lifted up and bear more fruit. And then I got to thinking, are there false vines? I think if you watch the development of Bruce Wayne and Batman, you very much see that at first he's connected to no vine, and then he finds what he thinks is the true vine, somebody that shares his values of justice, or what he sees as justice. But he soon realizes that this is a false vine. They're following a perversion of his sense of justice. And I got to thinking, what are some false vines for us? And a lot of people, especially in the biblical studies world, will suggest that the church is a false vine. The church, and I think I see it a lot, and a lot of seminary students see it, that the capital C church, the global church, is very much a false vine, in that a large segment of us are getting away from being connected to Jesus, and we're fulfilling our sense of Jesus' ministry without the power of being connected to the vine. And I think that in this particular passage, Jesus is moving from parable straight to application in verse 7. He's calling us to abide in Him by the power of the vine, and that's really what the application boils down to is the idea of abiding. And I think he gives two. It's kind of a twofold system. It's an effective prayer life is part of abiding, and loving one another, his great commandment in verse 12, is the other part of abiding. But then, as I'm going through each verse, I get to the end and I say, okay, we're supposed to bear fruit so that we can be pruned to bear more fruit instead of being thrown away and burned. But Jesus doesn't tell us what the fruit is. In the Great Commission, he makes the mission really clear. It's very explicit. But in this passage, he just says, "Go and bear fruit." And so I'm left thinking, what does that fruit look like? And I know that it's not something necessarily objective. I don't think it's this idea of, discipleship is not the bearing fruit that Jesus is talking about. Evangelism is not the bearing fruit that Jesus is talking about. And those are definitely parts of bearing fruit. They're the fruit of bearing fruit. But what I see is the fruit that Jesus is talking about is the idea of holiness or sanctification. It's being perfected in love, being perfected in the love of the Father through Jesus. And that's the focal point, I think, of the vine and the branches passage, is love one another. Jesus moves in verse 10 to, "He who keeps my commandments, God will give him whatever he wishes." And then when it moves into verse 12, he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And so I think that's really the focal part here. And it's kind of interesting that also, there's no expounding on what that means. He makes it sound, and really by the life he lives, he makes it look really easy. But I think the more we look into loving one another as Jesus commands, the less easy it looks. I know that Dr. Donjel on campus here will say that in his IBS John class that the love that Jesus commands for one another in John 15:12 is literally the hardest thing that a Christian will ever do, ever. Because it's more demanding than what we initially think. It's more demanding than what our culture says it is. Because what 21st century America says love is acceptance, tolerance, charity. The list goes on and on. But That's not what love is. Love is something. Love might tell a friend that what they don't want to hear for the good of their own soul. Love seeks intimacy, and love forgives. And above all, love is about self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is love. That's why Jesus continues the discussion on love in verse 13 and says, "No greater love has one than this, than to lay down his life for his friends." And I don't necessarily think that Jesus is explicitly saying in order to love somebody you have to give your life for them. He's using his own life as the example. But by that very verse, love is by nature self-sacrificial. Jesus here calls us to a love that looks at somebody else and says, "I'm going to do what's in my power so that you can thrive, so that your spiritual life, so that every aspect of your life is thriving." To love one another as Jesus commands, we give ourselves to the total transformation, to all total transformation, so that our innermost disposition becomes loving. Love can't just be internal. If love is just internal, then it doesn't change how we live. It doesn't do anything. It's not fulfilled love. But neither can love be only external, because people won't see that we're disciples of Jesus if our external acts of love aren't guided by something internal. If we haven't completely been changed, our very disposition towards other people haven't been changed to look at people and love them as God does, then nobody's going to see that in our acts of love, and then our acts of love just become altruistic. It's just self-sacrifice for what really becomes self-sacrifice becomes selfish because we're doing it so that we feel good, and that's not the sense of love that Jesus gives at all. So love is both equally internal and external. One leads to the other, but both are necessary. Love is, as Jesus describes it here, is really seeing and believing that even your worst enemy is a child of God, and then moving to pray for them even though you see them as your worst enemy. And it's praying for them with that mindset that this person is a child of God, just like I am, and that they have similar needs. They have just as much a right and a responsibility to live into God, who God has called them to be. It's in this way that we bear the fruit of Jesus Christ for the glory of God the Father.